Sam, congratulations, first of all. A book more than 20 years in the making and a great success.
Well, thank you very much, John. You know, when I signed the contract in 1998, and the deadline was supposed to be 2004, which is right around the time I started working for Arthur Sulzberger as the editor of the New York Times Book Review.
Well, it is a monumental life. It has caused controversy in some circles, but it is selling, which is no small feat in a history book world right now. One question I wanted to kick off with is, you knew Buckley. He selected you as his biographer. How much do you think his personality is what led him to be such an effective leader of a movement?
Well, for those of you who remember or saw Bill Buckley in action, and I know many people in this room did, it was an overpowering, charismatic personality, but not exactly of the kind we're used to today. Buckley was almost comically genteel and courteous. Are people familiar with those two words? If not, do Google searches for them. And he was a fantastic listener. Richard Brookhiser, who was one of his proteges. This is how Buckley worked. Richard Brookhiser published his first cover story in Buckley's famous National Review, his magazine, in 1970 when Rick was just about to turn 15. He was a high school student in outside Rochester, New York. And he wrote, this classic for Buckley, he wrote a piece objecting to the Vietnam moratorium. Remember the Vietnam moratorium? And he sent it off to Buckley, and Buckley put it on the cover. And so in some ways, Rick Brookhiser knew Buckley better than, and for a longer period of time, than any other working journalist. Rick is my age. We're both 70, and he's still at National Review. And he said, he wrote a wonderful review of the book, and he said the discovery for him in it was to realize, not learn, but realize, which is really important, because it means he's recalling something he knew but hadn't made sense of, is Buckley was a great listener. We remember all the repartee, the humor and the wit, sometimes, harsh exchanges with his debating opponents. And I remind people, Bill Buckley was generally called the greatest debater of his time, but the two most famous debates he was involved in with James Baldwin and Gore Vidal, he lost. But even there, you see, and it's a physical thing, Buckley listening. He wants to know what you're going to say so he can club you over the head with it, but he's going to listen to it first.
I guess it is an interesting point about his debate technique and linking, is how much of the charm, how much of the sense that he's setting a table, a party that you want to come to, is necessary as a straw that stirs the drink around the conservative movement, which previously had been sort of grim, Bircherite, humorless.
It was really important, John, because not just Bill, but his wife, Pat Buckley, who was called New York's tallest socialite. So there's a famous story, that John Leonard, one of my predecessors at the book review.
A great writer, another New York, National Review alum, right?
He was a Buckley discovery at the age of 19. He'd been kicked out of Harvard, and Buckley hired him. There's a funny story there because Buckley brought him in and said to Leonard, this is 1959, Buckley's about to go off on a ski trip. He's always about to go off on a ski trip or a sailing adventure. And he says, look, I'd like to hire you for the princely sum of $100 a week, which was a lot back then. And John Leonard, just thrown out of Harvard for not going to class. He was a great journalist there. And Buckley says, well, are you a liberal? And Leonard says, well, not really. And he said, but I'm interested in the job. First, at National Review, but first I'll have to talk to my fiancée. And Buckley said, where's the fiancée? And he said, we're going back in time, Radcliffe. And Buckley said, tell her it's the New Republic. He could just kind of accept, so he had social graces, but he could accept that you could joke about all these things. That was important for him because when he came of age, it was just almost an entirely liberal culture. So Buckley he aspired to have, we're talking about the New York Times Book Review at the table here, he aspired to have reviews on the front cover of the New York Times. The Times was the model for him. He told me it was the only newspaper he read, was the New York Times. And in fact, one reason National Review did not cite sources, this is in the correspondence. Someone said to him, Bill, why don't you list where you're getting, inform the reader in the editorials you publish where all the information's coming from. Buckley said if we did that, you'd see that every article we're writing is just a reaction to the New York Times. Number one, and the magazine he liked best was the New Yorker. So his proudest moment as a writer was when William Shawn of the New Yorker called him up and said he was going to serialize one of his books. And so it showed you that he was very much a figure in this kind of New York culture. National Review's in New York, still a New York magazine published here.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that about Buckley that is hard to get our head around, which is he, in our hyper-partisan era, there are not a lot of friendships across aisle, but he not only is close friends with Murray Kempton and Allard Lowenstein, I mean, really avowed liberals of that time, but even the staffing of the magazine, I mean, whether it's John Leonard or Joan Didion, I mean, people whose politics are heterodox, but not movement conservatives, he's able to bring together a much wider array of people that we see. Why did that part of his legacy not translate within the conservative movement?
Well, there are two things to say about that. First, and we get to the question. One is that the publisher of National Review, Bill Rusher, once said, Bill Buckley is just enamored of good writing. And he said, thank God the Communist Manifesto wasn't better written, or we would have lost Buckley. And the other is the great line Buckley had for these brilliant writers. And we left out the one, and it happens a lot, who was National Review's greatest discovery was the religious and political and historical writer Gary Wills, and whom they discovered at the age of 23. So they brought John Leonard in. Buckley said, well, John Leonard is time to mature because we brought Gary in at 23, and he's doing better now. Leonard's 19, so he has more room to grow. So Buckley had a great phrase for those writers. Another one is Arlene Croce, who invented dance criticism in America. Basically left National Review, went to the New Yorker. And so Buckley said, well, National Review became a finishing school for apostates. Which is a great phrase, by the way, because it's descriptive. He doesn't vilify anybody, right? He's not scoring cheap points. He's kind of using language to elevate everyone else, and he loved doing that. And so to answer the question, why don't we have that now, it's paradoxically a consequence of Bill Buckley, which is one of our themes today, because Bill Buckley's, a little bit like Oscar Wilde, his talent went into his writing, but his genius went into his life. And the genius was in creating a conservative media ecosystem. So that by the time he was through, there was an alternative media, which we're seeing now, that doesn't think it has to acknowledge and flourish in a world of conversation with liberals. Two other proteges of Buckley's, by the way, were Jeff Greenfield and Mike Kinsley. Buckley would bring them onto firing line to be kind of foils. And Tanenhaus, and all he looked for was talents, the only thing that mattered to him. And so, I am not a talented writer. I'm hardworking. And that's why he had confidence in me early on to write about Whittaker Chambers. He just knew I meant to get this book written. And that was more important to him than what my politics might be.
So let's go to the book and the chronology. First of all, this is a little bit of shop talk, but a room full of journalists. Why did you decide not to have an introduction or conclusion, but sort of go page one, opening paragraph, right to the birth? Right? It's cradle to grave.
Yeah, that question has come up a couple of times. And as you might guess, any of you who've written books, and there are a lot of people in this room around, don't think I didn't try writing an introduction, or about 6 or 8 different ones. And I thought, I'm stating rather than showing. I think I can pull a reader into the life. But there's another reason. when the Whittaker Chambers book was published, that also did not have an introduction, but it had an appendix. I was very much in the thrall in those years to the great biographer Richard Ellman, who wrote the biography of James Joyce. And so I had an appendix. And what the appendix in that book did was to summarize all the latest findings and evidence in the famous Alger Hiss perjury trial. And I got a call from a very good journalist, I won't say his name, who was writing something for a magazine, I forget which. And he said, well, I haven't read your book, but I read the appendix to see where the trial came out. I thought, I'm not this time. This time, you're going to have to read it to find out what the story is. And I just thought with Buckley's life, if I'm going to kind of demonstrate that I can tell a story, let's just start with the story. Let's just go. Yeah.
All right, this is rooted in a little bit of his upbringing, right? He is not Eastern establishment to the manor born, despite being very patrician. What is weird about Buckley to me always has been he is the most aristocratic seeming American. He is so patrician, and yet, of course, he helps birth a populist movement. And someone who plays the harpsichord can say, I'd rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston phone book than the 2,000 people on the Harvard faculty.
You're the first person to get that quote exactly right.
All right, there you go. But how do you square that particular circle? Because there's a fundamental contradiction with those two things.
There are many, many contradictions with Bill Buckley. And one of the interesting aspects of doing this kind of work when you deal with a large figure is you can't reconcile the opposites. It's really this kind of, Picasso portrait where you just show the three noses each from its different angle. But this is why, and I know I'm in the right room to say this, we begin with the reporting. So what's some of the first reporting you do, John? You go to Sharon, Connecticut, where Bill Buckley was raised, and you see that magnificent home, 47-acre estate. How many people know the northwest corner of Connecticut, Litchfield County? It's exquisitely beautiful. My great friend Katie Roberts knows it very well. She lived for a number of years in Washington, which is one of those beautiful towns up there. She's got in Sharon, Connecticut, with this beautiful 1.5 mile long green. And across from the Buckley's Manor House are the Episcopal Church, and always in Connecticut, the Congregational Church. But the Buckleys were Catholic. That meant when they got in the 3-family Buicks, there were 10 children and at least that many servants and groomspeople and help. This is the 1930s and 40s. When they got in the 3 Buicks and drove around the green, they went to a virtual alley in Sharon, Connecticut, where the tumble-down, thrown-up overnight Catholic church was. And who's worshiping with the Buckleys in that little church? It's not their patrician neighbors. It's the people who are working in the households, the garage mechanics, the local farmers, or the descendants of the iron workers in, it was called, the Iron Valley, that part of northwest Connecticut. So Buckley was raised, he and his 3 brothers were altar boys in a kind of working class Catholic church. And I realized when I did this, that's the seeds of the silent majority, the moral majority, the backlash politics we saw later. Buckley was more comfortable in that climate than you might imagine. And here's the thing, because he's not really a patrician, he was great at playing one on TV, right? Just as we could never imagine today, I'm just going to throw out just a bizarre example to show you how different the culture was then. Imagine in this day and age, some guy who's actually a bankrupt going on television and pretending to be a billionaire and having tens of millions of people believe him. That's how it works. That's the public side of politics, which Buckley really grasped.
Buckley's religion, his Catholicism influences his conservatism in a way that's very different from sort of movement conservatism and evangelical coalitions today. But we do see today a strong tie between conservatives, particularly jurists, and Catholicism, or conservative or Catholic converts. And now that we're well past anti-Catholic bigotry as a major issue, I just wonder, in researching this book, how you think about the influence of Catholicism on conservatism and vice versa.
It was so important, John. And Buckley, in a statement he made when he had one of his very few differences with the Vatican, and a reader was upset, and Buckley said, if it ever comes down to a choice between my conservatism and my Catholicism, Catholicism will always come first. And that he got from his mother. Are there any Catholics in the room? Daily communicant, his mother. Went to Mass every day. The Buckley sibling said, she prayed for everything. She prayed, when a child coughed. Well, so you think, well, what does that mean? Well, it means she came from New Orleans at the time of its pestilences and epidemics, and you did pray when a child was coughing. So Buckley grew up in the bosom of the church. His two ambitions when he was young were to be either a priest or a classical pianist. And he didn't have quite enough of the devotion to be a priest, and he didn't have the talent to be a musician. One reason he was able to discover these very gifted writers, who he was the first to say were more talented than he was. That's another unexpected thing with Buckley, was an odd humility he had. He didn't overstate his importance, his influence, or his own gifts, but he could sense them in the people around him. So I worked on this book for so long that I actually interviewed Buckley's childhood piano teacher in 2003 before she died at the age of 92. And I said, and Buckley was still in touch with her. He was an amazing steward of friendships. And I spoke with her on the phone, and I said, what about Bill Buckley, the pianist? And she said, he actually played rather badly, but with a kind of bravado that made you think he was better than he was. And I thought, there's a pretty good summary of Bill Buckley's career. And then she said, but he had exquisite taste. He knew when he was hearing really great music. And that's what happened with the writers he hired and nurtured and all the rest. That's where his talent was.
Interesting. Yeah. Let's go to God and Man at Yale. You describe it as the best book he ever wrote, his first book. It's an iconic book. There's something absurd about God and Man at Yale that we don't talk about enough, right? I mean, this book is published in what,
1951.
51. And you would think the Yale campus is this decadent, far left, hippie, because he's got to come in with a revanchist and say, we need to restore things the way they were. It's getting a little bit out of control here. Putting aside a couple of campus Marxists who no doubt were great irritants, that script has been rewritten by every generation of campus conservatives. But do you see something not just quaint but absurd about his complaints in the rearview mirror of history?
Well, first of all, I would not say, John, that it was his best book. I think his best books are his memoirs, and I do recommend them. His book, Cruising Speed, is a joy to read. Covers 1 week in his life. That's how active he was. And his life was so busy that 10 years later, he wrote essentially the same book and called it Overdrive. 1 week in the life of Bill Buckley, the cascading names he drops and all the rest. But God and Man at Yale transformed the conservative movement in America. Why? Because Buckley saw, this was his genius, that ideological battles were going to be waged through the culture. And it was interesting, John, when Margaret interviewed me, and I mentioned, I'm really glad she made this point, I mentioned how politics in Buckley's mind was cultural, and she initially said, do you mean he was talking about wedge issues? And I said, no, those didn't really exist yet. It meant that the battlefield was cultural. Who publishes the best magazines? Who's the most read columnist? Buckley viewed politics that way. So with God and Man at Yale, what he did was to describe what was really a kind of conservative campus. As you say, Yale was one of the most conservative of the Ivies. Right? It wasn't Harvard, it wasn't Columbia, but he described it as if it were radical because he knew two major constituents, two parts of his audience would find it radical if he described just what was taught in the classroom.
The donor class?
The donor class and the parents of Yale men. Remember, it's all boys then, right? 1969 is when it became co-ed. Buckley was there from 1946 to 1950. So one of the most brilliant pieces ever written about Buckley was the very first profile written, and it's great to be in an audience where I can say this name and be confident some will recognize it, was Dwight MacDonald. All right, the cultural critic wrote just a remarkable profile of Buckley for the Reporter magazine. Remember the Reporter? And MacDonald had been assigned to do this, and he liked Buckley because MacDonald had been a Yale man of an earlier generation, and he saw right away Buckley's a kind of radical. That it's not Yale that's radical, it's Buckley who's radical in his denunciations. And what does he say? He says, well, the religion professors are not religious. And the economics professors are not free marketers. They are Keynesian New Dealers. And as MacDonald said, anybody else would say, and your point is, what else is new after the New Deal and World War II? Buckley knew it was news to the older generation. How did he know that? Because Buckley was the star undergraduate fundraiser and speaker for the campus. They would send him around because of his charm and wit to audiences like this to try to explain what was going on at Yale, and he was a pretty good salesman for it. And in the book, he very smartly and strategically turns that around. But here's the genius of the book is in its subtitle, which is the, quote, superstitions, unquote, of academic freedom. So why is that a brilliant phrase? Well, because the basis of the book was a lecture a sociology professor gave, which drew on the teachings of Franz Boas and cultural anthropology. And the professor said, if you look at religions across the globe, they're all kind of alike. They all have rituals. They all have their own liturgy. They can seem strange to outsiders. And the professor described how when he had met Jesuit missionaries in the Philippines, they'd been shocked by this. And they said, well, what about the Eucharist? And the professor said, well, let's do a chemical analysis of the hemoglobin and of the wine. And if we find hemoglobin in it, then I'll believe that it's really the blood of Christ. And the classroom erupts. And Buckley, the devout Catholic, is a little surprised by this. And so that's the basis of his book. That it's not just that the professor is a non-believer, but that in the classroom he seems to be preaching or at least espousing an alternative idea about religion. Well, all well and good, except as Buckley said, he is drawing on one set of ideas and leaving out another set. Kind of the argument we're hearing today. It is the same. But what made the book a success is what all his colleagues, all his classmates at Yale, and his mentor, a brilliant and eccentric political scientist named Wilmore Kendall, who worked closely with the book, told Buckley not to do. They said, whatever you do in the book, don't include the last chapter, because it will discredit your entire argument. That last chapter says, well, what are we going to do about these atheists and left-wing economics professors? He says, well, wealthy donors should stop contributing, and alumni should not participate in fund drives. Exactly what we're seeing now. So that was the playbook.
I mean, the echoes are, including young conservative sort of editorial entrepreneurs getting a donor class on their side early.
Yes.
Let's talk about National Review. It is kickstarted a few years later. There are two events that he's pushing off of, and this is the reactionary side of conservatism. I don't want to oversimplify it, but there's the rejection of Joe McCarthy, and he's a defender. And there's also Brown v. Board. And you make a lot of the fact his family is Southern. Some of the early, National Review editorials are quite damning in the eyes of history, including one which Buckley distances himself from subsequently. How do you understand those two movements and how those two incidents and how the reaction to them really helped seed the modern conservative movement?
Well, some professional historians I've spoken to, I'm a journalist and writer. I don't have a PhD. But the ones who do have PhDs and study this stuff told me that for them, the news in the book is that it answered a big question. How do you get from the erudite and effete Buckley and his crowd in New York to the backlash racial politics in the South? And the answer is through one guy, Bill Buckley himself, because they fused in him. And the anti-communism is really the basis of the relationship with McCarthy. I have several chapters on that, and they're some of my favorite in the book. You know, people will tell me, how could you stand to write about all these terrible things Buckley did? And I said, to me as a storyteller, it's fascinating and rich material. Buckley was very close to Joe McCarthy. McCarthy was the first true populist to come out of the movement since the days of the Depression of Father Coughlin and such. He was the first post-war populist. And it was actually Buckley's mentor, Wilmore Kendall, who told him, keep your eye on this guy. It doesn't matter whether he's getting the facts right. He's stirring up the liberals. And that's what we want. He's got them on the defensive, and he's going after what today is called the deep state, and back then was called an invention, a coinage of National Review, the liberal establishment. National Review invented that term. So after McCarthy was brought low, Buckley and his allies, most of whom were ex-communists, by the way, and so they think in these very apocalyptic terms. Very
Whittaker
important.
Chambers. Yeah.
Whittaker Chambers is one. James Burnham is another. They see it as a defeat, not of politics, but again, of culture. The liberals framed the debate. The liberals decided they were able to depict McCarthy in a certain way. And Buckley was not just a defender of him, he was a champion. And he and his brother-in-law, Brent Bozell, who in some ways is as important a figure as Buckley. Any of you who are interested or following the post-liberal intellectuals now, Adrian Vermeule at Harvard or Patrick Deneen at Notre Dame, I would add Ross Douthat, I think, is one of them, though he's kind of in and out of the group. Brent Bozell is really their ideological godfather. He had the idea of what they call the confessional state, the religious state. Well, Buckley and Bozell wrote a defense of McCarthy called McCarthy and His Enemies. And if you look at that book, you'll see a lot less on McCarthy than you do on his enemies. Just as if you read the writings of the circle, the orbits around Trump now, there's much less about the virtue, right, and successes of Donald Trump, the president, than of the perfidy and betrayal of his enemies. That's where they saw was how the argument would work. It's about what you're against. You know, when I was at the Times Book Review, not long after I got there, I wrote a very long piece on the great historian Richard Hofstadter. And I think it was actually, a pretty good essay. But one thing I regret in it was that I was tough on Hofstadter for saying people, Americans, vote against things more than they vote for them. And now I realize Hofstadter was actually right about that. We vote in reaction. So that was the communist part. Well, McCarthy imploded during the famous Army McCarthy hearings some of you will know about. There were very few television sets in America nationwide in that period. There were probably fewer than 100,000, or maybe there were just that many television sets in people's living rooms. David, you would know because you wrote the great book on Sid Caesar. Is that about how many there were? The Army McCarthy hearings, right? So 100,000 television sets in the 50s. The Army McCarthy hearings had an average viewership of 20 million because people are watching them in bars, bar rooms. They're gathering together, right? And McCarthy goes down in this very public way, and his nadir came really in the spring. You could even pinpoint it, May of 1954. What's the big event in our internal, right, culture that came with a Supreme Court decision in 1954? It's the Brown decision. And Buckley, who had not only had connections to the South, his family spent every winter in the town of Camden, South Carolina, which is about 30 miles from Columbia. This is an audience I will understand. I'll tell you that the home Buckley's family lived in Camden had been Mary Boykin Chestnut's last mansion. She's the author of The Diary from Dixie, the great unwritten novel of the Civil War. That was a home Buckley's father beautifully refurbished and renovated. The Buckley family secretly, this is another piece of news I uncovered, published a segregationist newspaper. It was actually the vehicle of the White Citizens Council in South Carolina. And if you track what was appearing in that newspaper, the Buckleys themselves kept a distance from it, except for Buckley's older sister, Priscilla, who actually edited it for a time. So Priscilla Buckley, who was the line editor, here's the room people know what a line editor is. She was a line editor for John Leonard, Gary Wills, and Joan Didion. She was editing that segregationist newspaper that's warning against the dangers of mongrelization and mixed racing if the communist NAACP has its way in the South. If you track that against the editorials, unsigned editorials in National Review, they match perfectly. And it began at that moment.
That's fascinating. I mean, that's also great.
That's the beginning of the modern conservative movement.
And
don't tell them at Commentary Magazine, however.
Well, and look, I want to fast forward. We're going to get to questions in around 10 minutes. It's fair to say that without Buckley, there is no Goldwater. Certainly, Bozell ghostwrites that book. We should say, by the way, the Bozell descendants, one was arrested at January 6th, and the other is now serving.
One of the many patriots.
I'm not going to even indulge it with that ironic air quote. But another serves as the ambassador to South Africa.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
I think a little under-remarked these days.
Yes, that's Bill Buckley's nephew who's the ambassador to South Africa.
But so there's no Buckley. I think, there's no Goldwater. There's no Reagan. I think that's enormously important. At the same time, he is this epochal figure. He is defining a movement that is translating to real political power. And one of the things you write about is that he tried and never completed an attempt to articulate his conservative manifesto, which seems like a real missing link. Why do you think he was unable to complete that?
Well, it's great to be in a room full of journalists because a lot of us get that you can be pretty smart and a pretty quick study and be able to comment on issues or report them as they come up, but maybe not generate that big philosophical argument. It takes a different kind of mind. And Buckley just didn't have it, and he knew that about himself. That's why he was happy to let other people do that instead. We don't use the term in the same way anymore, but in his age, he was called a publicist, a promoter of ideas, an espouser of ideas. He was superbly good at it. And when in the book, there's some phrases I've used that are circulating now, some by reviewers who liked the book and some by those who didn't like it so much. And I say he was a performing ideologue, and he was a kind of intellectual entertainer, and he was not the best thinker or writer, but he was the most articulate voice. And some are taking these to be insults. They're not. It's the kind of mind he had. If somebody said I was the most articulate voice among American biographers, I'd feel pretty good about it.
But he's so articulate. He's so prolific. He finds time for spy novel series and a regular column, which was we included in the Deadline Artist Anthology. Some of them were very good. Some of them were dashed off. The magazine editing. How does he not prioritize, or was it actually difficult for him to square the circle with what sometimes he called conservatism, sometimes he called libertarianism, that he actually couldn't actually resolve the contradictions in his own mind about the movement he was building?
Yeah, that extremely well put, John. It reminds me, there's a wonderful essay Buckley wrote in 1963 where he said, you can put me in a room, any room like this one. He said, you can blindfold me, spin me around like a top, and I will be able to find every liberal in the room, but I couldn't tell you who the conservatives are. And something I learned from one of my own kind of whisperers for this book, someone who helped me a lot with it simply by answering questions, and later at the age of 90 reading the galley, is the great Gary Wills. And one thing I found with Wills is he almost never writes about conservatism. He writes about conservatives. So if you look at the very last page of my long book, which, by the way, there's 1,000 pages, yes, but that's only if you include the notes in the index. It's really just 850 something. Well, when you get to the end, you'll see where I say that Buckley was unable to say, and nobody else could either, really, what conservatism was, but everybody knew who a conservative was. That's why Buckley's best books are the memoirs. It's what he was a great phrase maker. This next phrase is not one of his best, but he had a phrase, the conservative demonstration. That means showing what conservatism is. He showed that better in the way he lived his life and the way, well, we all saw him on firing line, and you can see it now. You can see the great exchanges or those debates he won and sometimes lost. That's Buckley, this kind of larger-than-life personality, but it was really hard for him to boil it down to a set of principles, mainly because he'd grown up so attached to them through his family that he never examined them in the way that we think an intellectual might.
So, as a biographer, you have perspective on him. Could you distill Buckley's conservatism to a few core principles or phrases?
That is, no one has ever asked me that, so I want to thank you all for appearing here. Well, what I would say, it began, the core of Buckley's ideology, and I think what does last is his anti-communism. And we have to turn our minds back to that era. Some of Buckley's best writing was done when he accompanied Nixon, was one of 3 columnists in the entire country who was invited to go to China with Nixon. And Buckley's account of Nixon in the great banquet hall in Beijing, shaking the hands of the communists who had presided over, the Cultural Revolution, is an extraordinary piece of writing. And that's where Buckley's emotions connected with the knowledge and information he'd picked up. Another good example of that, where Buckley rises above just the level of mere disputation, is when you see some of the last great columns he wrote questioning the war in Iraq. And the reason is that his oldest friend, who had been his roommate in boarding school in Dutchess County, New York, right across the border, the Connecticut border, the Millbrook School, was a British emigre, Alistair Horn, who wrote a great book about the Algerian Revolution, pointing out all the errors the French made. And Buckley had read it. He read it before other people did, and later it became a kind of text for the Bush administration. And some may remember Maureen Dowd wrote quite a controversial column about Alistair Horn and her conversations with the Bushes. That was the knowledge Buckley acquired over time. So what I found, John, was that in his twilight years, Buckley did become a kind of sage because he'd seen so much and experienced so much. And I vividly remember asking him at the time of the Iraq War, when it was going badly, I said, could this be the Republicans' Vietnam? And he said, absolutely. And there are many who will say right now, that's what got us where we are today. I think Ross would be one of those, Ross Douthat, who would be one of those who would say the failure in Iraq is one reason we've got Donald Trump today. I felt like a betrayal to an entire generation. And a point I'm big on now, I may be writing about this, is I've gotten sort of hung up on generational politics. And I think we're living now in a period of generational politics. What does that mean? I think Buckley was very aware of generational politics. Well, I'll just throw out some things to you. If you look, there's a famous year, as 1946, is when 3 really talented legislators, national legislators, were elected for the first time. John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and Joe McCarthy. All World War II veterans, extreme anti-communists. Everybody knows, right, that if you were in this room in 1950 and made a negative comment about Joe McCarthy, John Kennedy would get up on the table and leave the room. And Robert Kennedy worked for Joe McCarthy, right? So that was one generation. That was the World War II generation. That same year, 3 baby boomers were born who represent, I think, the next presidential generation. We talked a little about this at the table. One was elected president, born in August 1946, was elected president in 1992. It's Bill Clinton. The second one, George W. Bush, was born in July 1946, was elected president. And the third was Donald Trump, who was born in June of 1946. 3 presidents all born in 1 year. It's never happened before in our politics. What do we know about them? Not one of them served in Vietnam. We do know about candidates who did serve. John McCain, John Kerry. Look how it worked out for them, right? So I don't say this in defense or attack, just the kind of thing I do. You know, anybody here who writes biography, and I'm sure there's some who are interested in it, and a lot of us just journalists, timelines are key to what we do, right? Yep. What happened when, what's the sequence? Well, I think now we're in a new generation of politics. So I say, and you know, it makes people uncomfortable, there's not a lot Nick Fuentes and Zoran Mamdani agree about, but Gaza is one of them. So what I take from that is these are 3 generations shaped by wars. And there's more of that in our politics than we realize. Buckley very much came out of wartime politics. We didn't even touch on the first war that mobilized him when he was a teenager. The very first public speech Buckley made, and it's shockingly brilliant for a 15-year-old, is his defense of Charles Lindbergh and the American First Committee in 1940. So Buckley is a phrase, and he gave it at Millbrook School. And he says, well, you know, maybe the French have the right idea here about submitting to Hitler. He says, because you cannot hold a mechanized army back with a megaphone. Thought, wow, that's a great phrase. Where'd Buckley get that? Well, we all know newspapers.com, right? Google. He didn't get it from anybody. He coined that at the age of 15. He wrote that. That's what you call an intellectual prodigy, somebody who thinks with the maturity of an adult as a child. Very rare, right? Music prodigies, chess prodigies, math prodigies, tennis prodigies, right? We get that. But intellectual prodigies are super rare. That is what Buckley was. That's why the book set him off and all the rest. Do not underestimate the sheer intellectual brilliance of this man. I encountered it in person. John, you know this because you were a host on TV. Sometimes if you watch people on like cable networks, right? I'm a junkie for it like everyone else. And you think, well, what a bunch of blowhards. But when you're in the room, what you notice is how incredibly fast their minds and mouths work. And Buckley had that too. And what Buckley saw was that he could become a voice for this new generation coming out of this prior political experience. That's below the surface with him. But it kind of flows through everything he does. And I think this is what we're seeing in our politics now, too.
All right, Sam Tanenhaus, everybody. Q&A time.
Thank you. Sam, what would Buckley say about Mitch McConnell's conduct on January 7th, 2021? And what would he say about Trump today?
This is my friend Alan from Connecticut. It's funny, we met in Connecticut in our new lives. I'm so glad you asked about McConnell. It's so smart because when I mentioned Buckley in Iraq, something I didn't bring up was he was sold on the Iraq war because he believed a speech Dick Cheney gave early on about weapons of mass destruction. And I said, Bill, what if he's not telling the truth? He said, impeach. Buckley, a conservative, said he should be impeached. And, of course, that means Bush should be impeached. The speech Mitch McConnell gave, my first thought was, I'm sure other writers in this room wondered about it too, who wrote it? It was letter and word perfect. And then he doesn't have the courage to do that thing. That's a failure. Bill Buckley pulled aside his older brother, James Buckley, remember him? The only conservative party member ever elected to the U.S. Senate from New York in 1960. 70. In 1973, Buckley pulled him aside and said, "You've got to pull the plug on Nixon. Tell him to resign." James Buckley was the first senator to do that, first conservative to do that. And his speech was written by Buckley, one of Buckley's many mentors, James Burnham, the political philosopher. That was an idea they had. National Review was very proud of this, of being skeptics about excessive imperial presidencies. Before Arthur Schlesinger, Bill's friend, circulated that term, imperial presidency, James Burnham used the term Caesarism. That's the more familiar one. It's exactly the same thing. So as a publication that very much valued the separation of powers and the Constitution, Article 1 of the Constitution, the legislature is not supposed to bow before presidents, for overreaching presidents. So that's one answer there. Trump is interesting because Buckley did 1,500 firing lines and never had Trump on it. And not many people who got the invitation ever said no to firing line. You know the famous Gore Vidal comment, there are two things you never say no to: having sex and going on television. And but I was told by the very first Buckley Fellow, a great journalist, many of you will know, Robert Costa, who was at the Washington Post and is now at CBS News. He was the first ever Buckley intern at National Review. He said Trump came by the office. It was right after Buckley died. And all he talked about was Buckley. He knew everything about him. Buckley, the personality. So there was an attraction there that was not returned by Buckley. And in fact, Buckley wrote negatively about Trump once. In 2000, when, remember this, Trump briefly considered running for the Reform Party nomination, the only time he lost to Pat Buchanan. And Buckley wrote a quite critical column about Trump. And I decided, I went back and forth about whether or not to include it. And I decided not to, because a lot of people said things like that about Donald Trump in the year 2000, including staff at National Review, who changed their minds later. So it didn't seem quite fair. Now I wish I'd put it in an endnote. You know, there were only 3,000 endnotes. I could have fit another one in there.
I'm Claudia Dreyfus. Hi, Sam.
Hi, Claudia.
Sam, you're very much an expert in your writing on what we call the McCarthy period, the late 40s, the early 50s. You touched on it briefly, but what are the parallels, if there are any, that you see between that period and what we're experiencing today?
You know, thanks, Claudia. Something people miss about McCarthy is, if you read some of the commentary, not so much now, but for many years, was the assumption was, well, McCarthy, like so many other anti-communists, is really going after Jews. That really wasn't so much the case, you know, Jewish immigrants or these radicals on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. No, he was going after the establishment. You know, his enemies were people like Dean Acheson. Those were the targets. That feels very parallel to this moment. When I did Steve Bannon's program, we've done 3 sessions, and we're doing a 4th tomorrow. And he was fascinated by Buckley and McCarthy, and the idea that McCarthy was the first to identify what's now called the deep state, the foreign policy and military establishment, which is really a distrust of government itself and of what seems to be an elite class that's dictating it. It doesn't begin with McCarthy. It actually begins with probably the most prescient book to come out of the modern right. You know, I said God, Man, and Ill, the most influential. Theoretically, the most important was James Burnham's book, The Managerial Revolution, which some of you may know, which is actually parodied at length in George Orwell's 1984, because he was one of many who really powerfully influenced by Orwell. And the managerial elite is the deep state. It's the hidden class of people who are really running things, pulling the strings. That's what many people on the right will say about my colleagues and bosses here at the New York Times, that there's a cabal. They're secretly, contriving to create news or to create acceptable ideas. McCarthy got onto that with his populism very quickly. We had an almost feral sense of it, and that seems parallel to today.
Nancy Wartic.
Whom I've known for many, many years.
Yes, many. Many glowing things being said about Buckley, and, he sounds like he was a brilliant genius. I also think it could be argued that some of his views on race, at least at certain points in his life, were execrable. He could be described as a white supremacist. And I think, there are reasons that he sided with McCarthy. Still, I mean, some people find it unforgivable, the idea of supporting McCarthyism. I mean, how do you look? To me, that says that he was morally compromised in some ways. What do you say about that?
I don't disagree with any of that.
Don't agree?
I don't disagree with any of it. I mean, certainly in race, there's no doubt about it. Buckley would have been shocked because of his own background to be called a racist, which makes no sense to us now, because we can see white supremacist he probably would have accepted. Yeah, I think so. Well, he has the notorious editorial where he says the whites are the culturally more advanced race. He not only in a notorious National Review editorial, but in a book he later wrote at greater length called Up From Liberalism, made what he thought was a reasonable case for not letting black people in the South vote as late as 1965. So this is the 50s. In 1965, after Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, National Review published a long essay by one of their favorite Southern writers, James J. Kilpatrick. Remember him? He used to do that Jane, You Ignorant Slut thing with Shana Alexander, the one that was parodied on Saturday Night Live. Kilpo, as they called him, wrote a long piece in National Review with the headline, "Should we give the Negro the vote?" And the answer was no. So yes, he absolutely was by any contemporary definition at that period racist. What I will say is he also grew. So if you watch National Review, if you see Buckley debating Muhammad Ali, who was his guest, on the virtues of the Nation of Islam, with Muhammad Ali defending Elijah Muhammad and Buckley taking the side of Malcolm X, or if you see the Black Panthers who appeared on his program. Bobby Seale and Huey Newton were both guests not Bobby Seale. It was Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver were both guests on Firing Line. And Eldridge Cleaver would stop by Buckley's apartment with his friend Timothy Leary for a drink, his apartment in Manhattan. So you think, well, what's that? At a tab, right. And and also in 1970, Nancy, I thought this was important. Buckley wrote in Life magazine that what the country needed, now we might find the reasons for it condescending, he said, but the country could use its first black president. He hoped it would be in 1980. So you think, okay, he's come farther along. And that's how I saw a lot of those things. And the same with McCarthy. He never could quite accept how much damage McCarthy had done. And you say, well, and I'm often asked this, well, how do I tolerate that? And I just think, well, my job as a reporter and writer is just to give him to you. And if I present Buckley to you and you think, how could this interesting man do those horrific things? And I thought, well, maybe I've given you enough sides of him so you can judge. but not for me. And it just happens to be either a quirk or debility or maybe even an advantage I bring to this kind of work that I try not to judge and just put it out there for you to think about. But there are real issues with him, and those aren't the only issues. Everybody remembers on the op-ed page of the New York Times, Bill Buckley's op-ed essay during the AIDS crisis about tattooing. He said gay men should be tattooed on their rear ends and drug users on their arms. And Jewish friends of his, including some I interviewed, told him, that sounds a lot like Auschwitz to us, right? And it was to Buckley's credit that he invited people like that into his world. And so what I think is what we could use now is we've got a lot of people with very harsh right-wing opinions. They're always going to be there. But some who are actually open to a genuine discussion might change their minds. I think that's where Buckley's a pretty good example for us.
Last question. Hi, Spencer Rumsey, Newsday. I had the honor of editing Murray Kempton's column at Newsday. So when I went to Murray Kempton's funeral, I was shocked that William F. Buckley came up to his son, who was standing next to me, Christopher Buckley, in tears, bawling his eyes out. He looked like a bleeding heart liberal to me. So what is that relationship? What's going on with Buckley and Kempton and people like Kempton?
I'm so glad you brought that up, and I wish I'd known that story. If you look at the very last collection of Murray Kempton's essays called Perversities, Rebellions, and that's it. Look at the dedication page to William F. Buckley Jr., whose genius for friendship passes understanding. Do you know why he wrote that? It's because Buckley paid for that book to be published. Buckley was convinced, you probably agree, and by the way, Buckley's acolytes, Joan Didion, Gary Wills, John Leonard, and John Gregory Dunn all agreed Murray Kempton was the greatest newspaper columnist in America. He was not syndicated. He was published here. So he didn't have the national following other newspaper people did, and when columnists did. And when Buckley brought young people in, first thing he told them was, you read Murray Kempton. This is the master of the art. So in his last days, Buckley arranged for this final collection of columns to be published, and he hired an editor to put the pieces together. Do you know who that was? How many of you know the name Darrell Pinckney? The black writer? Yeah, he was the editor. Buckley paid to put together Murray Kempton's last collection because Kempton wanted Pinckney to do it. And then when the book came out, this kind of thing, there's just not room to put in a biography of this. Buckley had the book celebration for Kempton, invited people Buckley hated, mortal enemies, because Murray wanted them to be there. And Buckley also said to Murray, he couldn't figure out which columns to include. Buckley said, well, if Mr. Pinckney's agreeable, why don't we do 2 volumes? Because your art should be preserved for posterity. So when you hear those stories, it's just hard not to appreciate who he was. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, John.